So let's continue on. We're in our series in the book of Ruth. I know some of you are like, I'm tracking along. I was enjoying this book until we got to Ruth chapter 3, and I have no clue what's going on. So we're going to get to that in a second. But let me just tell you, so one of the things I enjoy doing is I enjoy visiting big cities. I grew up in a big city. I love to visit big cities. I love going to New York. I've been to Paris, and just being able to see all the different cultural things in the city. And one of the things that I enjoy the most, and this might surprise some of you, is I love to go and see the different art museums. You know, so I grew up in Philadelphia, and so the big art museum there where Rocky Balboa lives, that's there. I've been to New York City, been to the Met there, the Louvre in Paris, and I love art. Okay, now, I would say this. I love art, however, I am not in any way an art expert. I don't even know if I would call myself an art novice. I probably call myself an art idiot. But I enjoy art. But there's one form of art that I've struggled to understand and to comprehend. And so in modern art, there's this type of art called abstract expressionist. Okay, and I can see it. I think it looks nice. I just don't get it. So I was doing a little research. I came across a painting recently by a guy named William de Kooning. De Kooning painted this painting called Interchange in 1955. The painting sold, I believe in 2013, for $300 million. So it's actually, if you look at it, it's a woman sitting in a chair. Okay, I know that because I looked it up on Google. That's how I know that. And so now you look at a painting like that, and you're like, okay, wow, that's interesting. It's pretty. I can see the different colors. But you kind of stand back and you're like, what the heck is going on here? I'm not 100% sure. I think that is in, you're like, wait, why am I bringing up abstract expressionist art? Because I think in a lot of ways, when you look at Ruth chapter 3, you're like, okay, it's in the Bible, therefore it must be valuable. But like, what the heck am I looking at here? Like what's going on in Ruth chapter 3? And so whether you've been in church for one day or whether you've been in church for 300 days, it doesn't really matter, because I think when Ruth chapter 3 comes along, it's a bit confusing. And so I think we have to just pause for a second, and as we dive into this section of the book of Ruth, we have to remind ourselves of two things in particular. The first thing is, when we're dealing with this type of genre in the Bible, this type of genre would be referred to as narrative. It's a story, it's a true story, but it is a story. What we have to remember is that narrative is not normative. Now, what I mean by that is, the writer isn't necessarily telling us in Ruth 3 that this is what we are supposed to go home and to do. All right? The writer is simply telling us what is happening. They're explaining what is going on in the story of Ruth and Boaz, between her and with Naomi and all of that. And so when we read the Bible, particularly when we get to these sections of the Bible, we have to discern what is descriptive, describing what happens, versus what is prescriptive, telling us to do something. And so in Ruth chapter 3, this is helpful for us just to know on the front end, Ruth 3 it's descriptive. It's not prescriptive, right? So narrative is not necessarily normative. The other thing, and I think more importantly for our time today, is we have to understand that in Ruth 3, there is a lot of ambiguity. There is a lot of things that are confusing, meaning in Ruth 3, there's a lot of cultural nuances that even some Old Testament scholars, some people that devote their entire life to studying these things, some of them don't even necessarily know all that is going on here. So when that happens, what we need to do is we need to be very careful to make sure then that we make the plain things the main things. Because what can happen is when you come to these texts that are a little bit more confusing and there's a lot going on and there's some cultural nuances, we can get so far into the weeds and arguing about, well, is it this, is it that? In fact, this week, reading different commentaries, there are multiple people that I would trust that fall on two different sides of what's happening here. The reality is we don't want to focus on that. We want to focus on the main things. And so what is plain in this text is the thing that we want to make the main thing today. And I would say one of the main things that you see here is this: that we can trust that God is taking care of every part of your life. That's our big idea. When we boil it all down, you're like, okay, what the heck am I looking at here in Ruth 3? I think the big thing that we can take away is that truth. You can trust that God is taking care of every single part of your life. Now, every one of us is trusting in something to take care of us. When I say the word trust, what I mean by that is, whatever it is that you trust to take care of you in your life, that is the thing that you are putting the weight of your life on. You're staking everything on it. Here's how I'll illustrate, okay? I'll use a movie to illustrate it. Okay, think about the movie Doctor Strange. You remember the movie Doctor Strange? Okay, Doctor Strange in the movie, he is a very accomplished neurosurgeon. In fact, he's probably the best. And so as a result of him being one of the best neurosurgeons, he's very arrogant, he's very wealthy, he thinks very highly of himself. That kind of opening scene, if you've seen the movie, you remember, he's kind of that guy. He knows he's the best. Well, he's out driving, and he's driving his super fancy sports car, and he ends up crashing it. What happens is it basically crushes all of the bones in his hands. Well, a neurosurgeon without his hands is pretty much useless. Do you remember what happens to him after he loses his ability to do surgery? His life spirals. He goes into this deep depression. It's like he doesn't have any more meaning or purpose or value in life. Now, he also meets the Sorcerer Supreme, and he learns a bunch of magic ninja moves to protect the earth. But that's besides the point, okay? The point is, you see that particular scene in the movie where he loses the thing that he has staked his whole life on, and as a result of that, he really doesn't even see any point of living. It's taken away from him because that's the thing that he has trusted in to take care of him. So I would ask you, what is that for you in your life? Well, let's just use that example. Maybe it's our intellect. When we trust in our intellect, we say, you know what, I'm a pretty sharp individual. I did really well in university. I'm very good in the business world. I can think well and make decisions well. What happens when early onset dementia takes place? And all of a sudden, the brain that you relied on to navigate through life and to be successful in whatever it is that you do, what happens when all of a sudden you can't remember simple things? Or take, for example, your job. Maybe your job is something that you have just put all of your trust and your energy in, and you thought, this is it. I have reached the pinnacle. I am successful. What happens the day that corporate decides to downsize? All of a sudden, that thing that you trusted in that you thought was not going anywhere, or when the stock market begins to crash and people aren't building homes anymore, and all of a sudden the thing that you built your life on that you trusted in to take care of you, now it's gone. Or even something as simple as your health. You think, I'm a pretty healthy person, and then all of a sudden you get that cancer diagnosis out of nowhere. The thing that you've trusted in, maybe it's your grades. Maybe it's your friendships. Maybe it's your relationships. I don't know, what is that thing that you have put the weight of your life on? Here's the thing. The book of Ruth, it reminds us in a very clear and in a very pointed way that at every turn and in every situation of your life, God is in control. God is weaving his plan for your life. And here's the thing, listen, when you understand that, when you get that, when that begins to sink in, not just here, but deep into your soul, when you understand that it is only God, that God is in control, then you realize it is only God that you can trust to put the weight of your life in, to control every part of your life. So I think that's what we see here in this section of the book of Ruth. And so what I want to do is I want to walk through, I want to look at a few different things here. One, I want to look at the outset of Ruth, chapter 3, where you see some risky advice. Naomi, the mother-in-law, is giving Ruth some risky advice. But then we're going to see Ruth's faithful actions. And then the last thing that I want us to get to that will actually kind of push us into next week is this redemptive outcome. All right? So, risky advice, faithful action, and then redemptive outcome. So just real quick refresher. I know some of you, maybe you haven't been here for the first few parts of this series. And so just to give you kind of those, really that kind of covers the three main characters. So Naomi in this story, she is the mother-in-law, and she is a widow. She not only lost her husband, she lost her 2 sons as well, and she's left with Ruth, the daughter-in-law, who has remained loyal to her. Ruth is an outsider. She is from the land of Moab. Moab was an enemy of Israel, and yet Ruth has come back to the land of Israel with her daughter, with her mother-in-law, with Naomi, and she's been essentially taking care of her. But then last week, Pastor Josh introduced us in chapter 2 to this character named Boaz. Boaz appears to be maybe the potential hero in the story. He's a man of God, and he's of high character. And so with that backdrop, let's jump back into chapter 3. Let's look at chapter 3. Go back to verse 1 here. It says, "Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her," here talking to Ruth, she said, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down on the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And Ruth replied, "All that you say, I will do." All right, what's going on here? Well, this is some risky advice here, so let's talk about this for a second, okay? Now, there's a shift. Here's what we need to say. Back up for a second. There's a shift that is taking place in Naomi, okay? Because if you remember back to the end of chapter 1, Naomi comes back from the land of Moab. They had left because of a famine in Bethlehem in Israel, and they had come back, and Naomi had lost her husband, lost her 2 sons, and she comes back and she says, "Don't call me Naomi anymore. Name change. Call me Mara, because I'm bitter." And so all along, since then, you've seen that Naomi has been despondent, she's been empty, she's been broken. And then all of a sudden here, there's a shift. Ruth has been the one that has been taking care of her. Ruth is the one we saw last week. She was out in the field collecting food, bringing it home for her mother-in-law. Now all of a sudden, Naomi is concerned about taking care of Ruth. Why all of a sudden is Naomi not as despondent anymore? What has happened? Well, Naomi's hope, you see, it starts in chapter 2. And what you see is at the end of chapter 2, the hope that she has there, it begins to bleed into her action here in chapter 3. So if you go back to chapter 2, verse 20, this is what it says. "And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed," that means Boaz, "may Boaz be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, the man," this guy Boaz, "he is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." So here, you know what this is? This is the line from Dumb and Dumber where they said, okay, so you're saying there's a chance, okay? You're saying there's a chance. There's like hope is all of a sudden introduced back into the story. And so Boaz is on the scene, which means that there's an era of hope. And here's the thing about hope. The thing about hope is that hope helps us to dream. That's one of the things that's so beautiful about hope in our life. It not only helps us to dream, it helps us to think up ways to do good. You can think of the opposite for a second. It's kind of a heavier illustration, but if you've ever in your own life or maybe in the life of someone that you are close to, if you've ever struggled with depression, in a lot of ways, depression is a sense of hopelessness. And so if you think about, whether it's yourself or whether it's someone that you know in your life who struggles with that, you think about depression and that sense of hopelessness. If you ask them to dream, they're like, what do you mean dream? I can barely get out of bed. I can barely face the things that are right in front of me. How are you asking me to dream about a future? So what ends up happening is that those who struggle with depression, they can't envision a bigger and better future because all they're trying to do is muster up the energy just to go throughout their day. This is what happens with hopelessness. It creates a barrier to seeing what is possible and to moving forward towards that end. Hope, on the other hand, as John Piper says, he says, hope based on the confidence that a sovereign God is for us, he gives us a thrilling impulse that he calls strategic righteousness. This is why the gospel is the lifeblood for hope. Because what the gospel reminds us of is that God is not only in control, God is for you. And if that is true, it's when you understand that truth that you can envision a better and a more hopeful future. Here's the thing, listen to this. You can envision a better and a more hopeful future even when your circumstances are trying to tell you otherwise. That's what the gospel does. That's the hope that the gospel infuses in us. And so Naomi, here, all of a sudden, she begins to sense some hope. And so she puts some plans in action. She desires a husband for Ruth. She wants Ruth to be taken care of. But not only that, she wants to preserve the family line. She wants to secure a future for Ruth as well. And she comes up with this plan. Now, we need to be very astute here as we read through this. And we got to understand that there is a lot of risky things involved with this plan. Okay, there were a lot of things about what Naomi was instructing to Ruth that they could have gone wrong. A lot in this plan that could have gone wrong. It makes me think, I don't know if you saw this years ago, but a couple years ago, there was an Austrian skydiver who got the ingenious idea that he was going to hop into a hot air balloon and he was going to float way up into basically almost outer space, and he was going to skydive. Do you guys remember this? Red Bull sponsored it. This guy's name was Felix Baumgartner, and so I mean, just it was nuts. And so he gets basically into an astronaut suit. He gets into this special hot air balloon. They send him 39 kilometers up into the air. I mean, it's basically space. Okay, I'm not an astronomer, but I'm pretty sure it's like almost space. And he gets up there and he skydives. From 39 kilometers, he was the only human being who's ever broken the sound barrier, okay? He's like 890 some miles an hour without like the use of an engine or something like that. And I remember watching, and I mean, they're just talking. I mean, the whole lead up to it is all of the things that could go wrong, and so they have all these engineers and these experts because there was just so many things with this plan that could go wrong. Now, thankfully, he ended up landing safely back on Earth, and it was pretty incredible to watch. But I think about that, and I'm like, okay, when I listen to Naomi's advice to Ruth, you're like, wow, there's a lot that could go wrong here. So, for example, she goes up to the threshing floor. I mean, Boaz might just not be there. What happens if he's not there? Well, that's unfortunate. More importantly, though, or I think probably more significantly, is what happens if she shows up, and Ruth does this, and Boaz rejects her? That would be pretty devastating, because not only would it mean that she forfeits a husband, but it means that her reputation will probably be ruined. She's really putting herself out there. So she goes up there and Boaz rejects her. Not only will she not have a husband, but her reputation from that point on will probably be ruined. And your reputation as a widowed woman in a foreign land, that's everything. Or maybe, I mean, it doesn't seem like he would, but they don't know. Boaz, maybe, what if he tries to take advantage of her? There's all these things that could go wrong, and there's so much risk involved in what Naomi is telling Ruth. I want us to pause for a second, though, because I think this is so helpful for us to see here. There's something important that Naomi is showing us as it relates to the Christian life. And that is this. There is a fine line between waiting in anxiety and acting in faith, and between waiting patiently and trying to manipulate outcomes. Think about that for a second. You kind of have these two different sides. There's a fine line in the Christian life between waiting patiently on the one hand and acting in what you think is faith. And then on the other side, there's a fine line between manipulating outcomes and waiting on the Lord. So here's kind of how you can think of it. This is maybe a diagram that'll be helpful. Okay? I think oftentimes what ends up happening is we tend to oscillate between two extremes. So you think about these two kind of pendulum swings. So on the one hand, you kind of can swing to the side when you're faced with risk. So let's just take, for example, the example of, sharing faith with someone in your life. I have a friend or a coworker or a family member, and I want to share my faith, but it's very risky. I'm not sure how it's going to happen. So what ends up happening is when we're faced with risk in the Christian life, I think we can kind of oscillate between these two extremes. On the one hand, you have passive resignation. You just kind of say, I'm just going to sit on the sidelines and not do anything. But on the other side, you have controlling manipulation. You're like, I don't see what's happening. I can't understand the outcome, so I'm going to start kind of grabbing for things and begin to try to make things happening myself. And what I want us to see, because I think this is what you begin to see in the story here, is I want us to settle in the middle and see how the Bible is pushing us towards active faith. It's not passive resignation. It's not controlling manipulation. So let's look at both of those. Let's start with looking at this idea of passive resignation. Because I think there's times when we're faced with risk, making these decisions in our life, where maybe we slide into that passive resignation. There's a book that I would highly commend to you by a guy whose name is Kevin DeYoung, called Just Do Something. And in his book, Just Do Something, Kevin DeYoung, he talks about this guy, Walter Houston. And Walter Houston, it's kind of like a satire obituary. Walter Houston is 91 years old, and basically this satire obituary of Walter Houston goes on to say that Walter Houston spent his entire life waiting to hear from the will of God. And they basically talk about how he walked around and he never really acted or did anything because he was constantly looking for the will of God. And so he never used the gifts that God gave him because he wasn't sure that that was what he was supposed to do. And he was so afraid and nervous that he was going to act in the wrong way that he went his whole life waiting to hear the will of God, died never actually doing anything. And so DeYoung uses this in his book, Just Do Something, to show us that we can have this passive resignation when faced with a decision. Now, I'm not talking about immoral decisions here, okay? So let me say, why is it that sometimes we slide into passive resignation? That we just struggle to move forward and to take action in our Christian life? I think there's multiple reasons. Let me point out two that I think are probably very common for us. I think one of the reasons is that we are afraid to take action because we think that we might mess something up. You're afraid you're going to mess something up. And what the story of Ruth shows us is that God is in control at every step, and he is much bigger than our ability to get it right or to screw it up. You don't think that the God of the universe who flung stars and planets into the sky, you think you're going to mess up something by making this decision that you're like, I don't know, maybe it's this or maybe it's that? As if God's not so much bigger than that, and so we kind of get afraid that we're going to mess up. Again, I'm not talking about immoral things. I'm talking about the decision between, do I take this job or do I take that job? And so we're afraid we're going to mess that up, and so it keeps us in passive resignation. I think another one is that we're afraid that because we don't know the outcome. We're afraid to act because we're not sure how it's going to turn out. Well, guess what? Look at verse 4. What does it say in verse 4? But when he lies down, this is Naomi talking about what she thinks is going to happen. When Boaz lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go uncover his feet and lie down. And what does she say? And he will tell you what to do. Translation, she doesn't know what he's going to do. She doesn't know. So I think for us, what we have to realize is that we need to stop trusting in known outcomes and trust in the one who knows the outcome. That's what it means to walk forward in active faith. Instead of being so consumed with, God, I want to know how this is going to turn out. No, let's put our faith in the one who we know holds the end. So we don't need to trust known outcomes. We can trust the one who knows the outcome. That's the one side of the pendulum swing. When faced with taking action, we can slide into passive resignation. But before we talk about the other side, let's see how Ruth responds here. Look in verse 5. It says, and Ruth replied, all that you say I will do. So she takes the advice of her mother-in-law. The next thing we see here is Ruth's faithful action. Ruth springs into action and she heads down to the threshing floor where Boaz is reported to be. Now, I know it's probably been a while since most of you have spent time on a threshing floor. So let me just kind of refresh your memory as to what the threshing floor is. Remember last week, Pastor Josh was talking about how Boaz's workers were in the field and they were collecting the wheat and the barley. Well, after all of the wheat and the barley would be collected, they would take it to this place that was known as the threshing floor. Oftentimes, the threshing floor was an outcropping that was a bit higher up because they wanted there to be a breeze, because on the threshing floor, you would beat out the wheat and the barley so that the excess, what they called the chaff, would blow away, and you were left with the things that you could actually use to cook and to make things. And so oftentimes, it was the owner of the fields, they were the one who would be in charge of this process. And they would go up to this place. Again, it was kind of up on a hill. Oftentimes they would do it at night because there was a nice cool breeze, and that would help to blow away the chaff. And so it was not uncommon for the man of that property to be located working late at night on the threshing floor. So that's where Boaz is. He's up there working hard, and he finishes the day with some good food and a nice refreshing drink. And then, like anyone who has put in a good day's work, he sleeps like a baby. You know that feeling when you've been working really hard, whether it's doing outside work or whatever it may be, and you come home. There's nothing better than sleep after a hard day's work. And so Boaz goes to sleep right there, probably because he's tired, but also trying to protect the things that he has there, the wheat and the barley. He sleeps right there with it. And so he is sound asleep. Ruth is there watching, and she's waiting, and it's at this point that she acts. Now, again, we got to ask the question, like, what exactly is she doing? Like, what is happening here? What does all this mean? What does all this suggest? Let me just simplify it, okay? All commentators agree on this, all right? Regardless of kind of all the little detailed nuances, what they all agree on is that what Ruth is doing is this is nothing short of a nonverbal message for marriage. It's kind of what she's doing. She's basically going to Boaz. She's shooting her shot. That's what she's doing. She's going to Boaz and saying, hey, I want to marry you. This is, you know what it's like? It's like when you were in middle school. Okay, you remember in middle school when you realized that boys were kind of cute and girls maybe don't have cooties? And so, you start to see someone that maybe you like, and so, but you can't talk to them. So you write the note, do you like me? And then you write the checkbox, yes, and then you write the checkbox, no, and you fold it up into this neat little, thing, and then you slide it across the table, That's kind of what's happening here, okay? This is a nonverbal message where Ruth is signifying to Boaz her intentions. I want to marry you. That's what she's saying here. So what happens? Look at verse 8. At midnight, the man was startled. And he turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, who are you? She answered, I am Ruth, your servant. It was very dark, so chances are he didn't know. He's groggy in his sleep. He can't really see. And so he's like, what is going on here? I'll explain that more in just a second. She says, it's Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. And he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear, for I will do for you all that you ask. And for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. Now, as you read this, any parent kind of has a bit of this feeling where you know that feeling of being startled in the middle of the night, where you are kind of dreaming and you feel like in your dreams someone is staring deep into your soul, and then you wake up and someone is right here staring deep into your soul. You know that startling feeling where you're like, I almost just karate chopped my own kid? So Boaz wakes up. And he's startled. Now, here's what the other thing we need to know about the threshing floor, okay? This is very important to understanding what's happening here because it really kind of draws out not only what's going on, but the type of people that Boaz and Ruth are. See, the threshing floor was also a place where there was a lot of sexual immorality. It was a place that was very celebratory, and so at that time of year when they were bringing in their harvest, it was kind of a big party, and so oftentimes they would have lots of food, they would have lots of drink, people would get carried away. And so on the threshing floor, you'd have men that were working late at night, and the women would come out from the town, and things would happen there that were in a lot of ways unspeakable. And so you need to understand that when Boaz wakes up and there's a beautiful woman lying at his feet, that was not an uncommon thing that would take place in those days. And I think what we need to do here is, the narrator, what the narrator is trying to do is, they're trying to get us as a reader to feel the relational tension and the sensuality. We want to try to maybe tame that. The narrator actually wants us to feel that tension. Because the reason that tension is important in this story is because it actually highlights the purity of Boaz and Ruth. Because instead of compromising, what they did is they remained true to what they knew God wanted for them in their relationship, particularly around this idea of sex, even in a day, remember what it said? In a day when everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. And so in a day that everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes, here are two individuals, grown adults, who decide not to compromise on what they know God's plan is and his desire for their life. And so what we see here is that Ruth and Boaz, they clearly stand out as anomalies in a sinful world, not compromising but trusting God for the outcome. Now, I think this is a good place just for us to pause and to look at the other side of the pendulum. We talked about passive resignation, but if we swing to the other side, what we see is the temptation in our own life to take matters into our own hands and to control things and to manipulate outcomes. And so you say, what does this look like? We live in those waiting periods of our life. What does it look like to take matters into my own hands and not trust God for the outcomes? Well, let's just talk about maybe not trusting God with your future spouse. Maybe you're here and you're single. What does it look like to not trust God with the future of your spouse? Well, maybe that's because you're now dating someone or you're tempted to date someone who doesn't align with your faith values. Well, maybe for you, maybe it's not trusting God with your finances. There's needs in your life. There's bills that maybe can't be paid. And so what ends up happening is instead of trusting God to provide for you, you end up starting to keep and to hoard and to not give generously towards God because you're not trusting God for provision. You think now you have to take matters into your own hands. Or students, maybe for you, maybe that's grades. Maybe you're not trusting God with your grades or the outcome of your schooling, and so maybe you begin to find ways to cheat or to amplify your GPA in a way that is unethical. There are all different ways in our life that things come along and we're like, God, I can't see how you're moving here. I can't understand how you're at. And so what we end up doing is we end up starting to take those things into our grasp. And it's in those moments of waiting when nothing seems to be happening that we begin to doubt that we can trust God with every area of our life. And when you begin to doubt that you can't trust God, you begin to compromise. And when you begin to compromise, you begin to manipulate outcomes. Instead, what we need to see and what we need to remember and what the story of Ruth is showing us is that just because you aren't seeing anything accomplished, that doesn't mean that nothing is happening. Think of it like when you go to a hotel. I'm sure this has happened to several of us. You go to a hotel and you go to check in. It's time to check in, and they're like, sorry, your room will be ready in an hour, And so you go, and they say, hey, you can go sit over there in the lobby and you can wait. And just, think about that for a second, all right? So you're in the lobby waiting. It would be ridiculous for you to think that just because you can't see them up in your room cleaning. Now, I know some of you are like, they're probably not up there cleaning, but go with me on this analogy, all right? It would be ridiculous to think that just because they're up there, you can't see them up there cleaning the room, that nothing is happening, right? I mean, that's silly. No, when someone says, hey, your room will be ready in just a minute, you can go over there and wait. Just because you can't see them cleaning doesn't mean they're not cleaning. That's kind of how some of us think about our life. We're sitting in the lobby and we're like, God, are you up there? I can't see you doing anything. And we just assume because we can't see God doing anything that he's not doing anything. What the book of Ruth reminds us is, no, God is very much in control. So you say, okay, well, how do I know that that's happening in my life? How do I know maybe if I'm the one that's now trying to take control of the circumstances of my life? One of the, I think, key ways that you know is that you stop praying for things in your life and you start trying to act in your own strength. Prayerlessness is probably one of the most key indications that you are now trying to manipulate the outcomes in your life and you stop trusting God. Think about that for a second. What does prayerlessness say? Prayerlessness says, God, I did it, I tried, this didn't work, now I'm going to take over. I think another way is just a lack of rest. You think about in the Old Testament, one of the ways that the Israelites disobeyed the commandments most frequently was their inability to keep the Sabbath. God said, look, work 6 days, 1 day a week, you're going to stop. You're going to cease from all work. You're going to trust me. In fact, the penalty for not obeying the Sabbath, it was very severe. And yet the Israelites, over and over again, in fact, some of the prophets who indicted the Israelites for their disobedience, that was like the main thing that they indicted them for. Not keeping the Sabbath. Why would they not keep the Sabbath? Well, because they didn't trust God with the outcome. God, I know you told me that one day a week I'm supposed to cease from rest, but you know what? Look at my field over there. If I'm not out there today doing something with it, then I don't know. I'm not going to get what I need. Some of us, we go, and we're constantly on the move, and we can't rest because we think that it's all up to us. And so if we struggle to not rest in our life, we need to just evaluate, is that because I'm trying to control the outcomes in my life, or just worry or anxiety? You know what worry is? Just you kind of boil it all down. You know what worry is? Worry is saying, God, I know that this is supposed to be on your shoulders, but now I'm going to take it on mine. And guess whose shoulders don't have the strength to support it? Ours. That's what worry is. So you have that lingering worry and anxiety in your life. What that is you taking things off of God's shoulders, who is fully capable of holding and handling everything in our life, and sticking it on yours. And so we swing to the other side of the pendulum, and we can see that we can either struggle with passive resignation, or we can struggle in our life to control the outcomes. And here's what we need to understand. Look, every time we take matters into our own hands, listen, it'll end poorly. Maybe not in the immediate, but in the eventual. It will end poorly. It will not end the way that you want it to or that you thought it would. And that's because the blueprint of God's provision, it is much better than anything that we could make up. I mean, think about the story of Ruth. I mean, just think about this for a second. I mean, that's how we see playing out here. There is no way that Ruth, a foreigner from the land of Moab, the enemies of Israel, there's no way that Ruth could have envisioned this provision and plan that God is orchestrating in her life. No way. No plan that she could have come up with comes near to what God is doing in her life here. And so it's here at the end of chapter 3 and on into chapter 4 that we clearly see the hand of God, the outworking of God's plan. So let's finish with that. Look at the end of chapter 3, verse 13. It says, "Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you." So listen, there's another redeemer that has first rights of refusal. We'll talk about that just here for a second. So there's another man that comes in front of Boaz who actually, he has the ability to redeem Ruth and all of the Elimelech's things. He has the ability to do that before Boaz. So we'll talk about that just a second here, but that's who he's talking about. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until morning. And so she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." And he said, "Bring the garment that you are wearing and hold it out." And so she held it. And he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. When she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" Then she told her all of the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me. For he said to me, 'You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law.' She replied, 'Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." The last thing that we see here is the redemptive outcome. Boaz brings along this redemptive outcome. There's a few things I think are important to see here. First, the reason that he tells her to stay the night is because he has her safety in mind. Because it's not safe. If she kind of wanders off in the middle of the night, there's a lot of things that could happen to her, and so he wants her to be safe, and so he keeps her there with him to make sure he can protect her. The other thing that you see here is he sends her off not empty-handed. He gives her a massive amount of barley. Now here's the thing. This gift is very symbolic. There's a lot of symbolism that's going on with this gift here. Because if you remember, what did Naomi say at the end of chapter 1? Naomi says at the end of chapter 1, "I have come back empty." Boaz says, "Take this back to your mother-in-law." What is he saying there? He's saying, "Listen, Ruth, Naomi, you will never be empty again in your life. You don't ever have to worry about having provision." He's symbolically telling her that he will take care of her. And more importantly, most importantly here, what he's saying is not only am I giving you food to eat, but I will redeem you. I will be the redeemer. That word there is the word kinsman redeemer, like Pastor Josh said last week, goel. And goel in the Old Testament, the role that they fulfilled in the book of Leviticus was that they were responsible for buying back the family land that had been forfeited. But not only that, they were not only responsible for the land, they were responsible for carrying on the family name by marrying a childless widow. So you think about those two things. What that meant is that the Redeemer, he needed to not only have enough wealth to purchase the land, but he also needed to have the willingness to sacrifice. So we see that here in chapter 4. Because again, there's another person who had first rights of refusal. And Boaz said, well, let me go to him first and let me see if he'll redeem you. And when this individual thinks that it's just the land that he's getting, he says, sure, I'll do it. But then look what happens. We'll close with this. Look in chapter 4, verse 3. It says this, then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I will come after you. And so this gentleman says, okay, I will redeem it. Then Boaz says this. He says, oh, by the way, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in their inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. You know, Boaz comes along and he says, hey, here's this land. You want to redeem it? The guy says, sure. He's like, also, by the way, it comes with a wife. And the guy's like, I'm okay, a hard pass. You know what this is like? This is like, have you ever seen that show Storage Wars? You know, this is like that show Storage Wars. You know, in California, there's this law that if after 3 months someone doesn't pay rent on their storage unit, that the storage place can actually auction off that unit and everything that's in it. So you have these people that go along, and what they do is they get a very quick glimpse. They don't get to go inside. They get a quick glimpse of all the contents. I mean, it's all boxed up. They can't really see. And they make a judgment call as to whether or not they're going to buy the whole thing. But here's the thing. When you buy it, if you win the bid, you get all the stuff. Doesn't matter what's in there. You get all of it. You get Granny's old dishes, and you get the expensive painting. Like everything that's in there comes with it. That's what it means to redeem somebody. The Redeemer gets all of it. You get the land, but you also get the wife. You have to perpetuate the family lineage here. And so I think as we close, just to see here what the story of Ruth helps us to see is it helps us to have a concrete understanding of what is involved in redemption, our redemption. So let's talk about that real quick. 3 things. First, when you think about our redemption, the first thing we need to see is it's personal. Our redemption is personal. The book of Ruth reminds us that redemption, first and foremost, it is a story with real people. It is not simply a theological system. Listen, there is always the risk of loving a theological system more than loving Jesus. The gospel is not mechanical. We don't talk about redemption as if it's something that just exists in a theological textbook. We talk about redemption because it exists in the person and the work of Jesus. That's what Christmas is about. Christmas reminds us that God is so personal that in order to redeem us, he became one of us. Emmanuel. God with us. And so God's redemption for you is not just some theological concept that exists on a page. It is God's very own Son who came to you. It is very personal. But not only is it personal, our redemption is also the result of our Redeemer. You're like, okay, what's that? What that means is that in this story, we are more like Ruth. We're the ones that are desperately in need of a rescue. We can't do that on our own. We are desperately in need of being taken care of, to be cared for. And like Boaz, Jesus, he finished the work of redemption for us. Not only did Jesus come as a man to live perfectly for us, but Jesus also died the death that you and I deserve. We could not redeem ourselves. You cannot save yourself. You need a redeemer, like Ruth. Jesus is that. Jesus is our perfect redeemer. Jesus is the one who makes you on the outside an insider. Jesus is the one who makes you without hope someone who now has unlimited hope. That's who Jesus is. He makes us who don't have a family now a part of Jesus' family. The last thing we see, though, is that our redemption is a result of our Redeemer's love. Why does God do it? Because he loves us. God desires to bring you back to himself. He initiated restoration. God came after us. We did not go after God. The reason he did so is because he loved us. Like Boaz, Jesus did not redeem us out of sheer obligation, but he did so out of delight. Jesus delights in you. He loved you so much that he can redeem you. That's the type of Savior, that's the type of person that you can trust with everything in your life. This last week, my dad, he is retiring after 40 years of working for the same organization. And on Friday, they did a big party for him, and they did a video. And they asked me if I would speak on the video. And I said, yeah, I'm way better than my brother and sister, so sure, I'll do it. I'll represent the family. I'll do it. And they said, share one memory. Can you share a memory? That's really hard. I mean, I love my dad. I have a great relationship with my dad. And so to be asked to share one memory that encapsulates my dad, that was hard. But I thought, you know what, and I've shared this with you guys before. I think one of the things that I think oftentimes that in a lot of ways summarizes my relationship with my dad is at this time of year, we would always be gearing up to take our trip from Philly up to PEI. And I remember those trips, you know, they were a lot of times very stressful. They took a ton of work, a ton of energy. There was a lot of times we were driving through snowstorms. There was a lot of, I mean, there's just a lot that went into it. Do you know who didn't think about that once? Me. I didn't think about it. We would ride in the car together, and I'd be in the back seat, playing with my G.I. Joes, picking on my brother and sister, sleeping like a baby. Why? Because I trusted my dad. I didn't have a care in the world. Why? Because I knew that my dad was going to take care of us. So I could sit in the back seat, and I could live my best life driving up to PEI in the middle of a snowstorm because I trusted who my dad was, and I knew he would take care of us. That's who your Heavenly Father is. Your Heavenly Father cares deeply about every part of you, and his desire is to redeem you. If that's what he desires for you, then you can trust him with every area of your life. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for this truth. God, we need it. God, we need it. We need to believe it. We need to live into it. And would you help us to do that? Father, we ask these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.